Hello and welcome to Chile Talk, a series of shortish videos about all things Chilean. I'm Neil Davidson, I'm a newspaper columnist here in Chile, a writer, and I'm with, as always, with Pete Lee, who's something of a historian.
Yes.
And who exists on the fringes of academia. No, not even on the fringes.
Yes, beyond the fringe.
In the black heart of academia.
Yes.
And what we're going to talk about today is the relationship between Chile and Latin America and even the Americas on the one hand, and East Asia, which of course is an extremely long-standing relationship because it goes back, what, 15,000 years?
Well, I think we're changing the numbers, but of course the first humans who came to the Americas came across the Bering Strait between Kamchatka in the Russian Federation now and Alaska. They came over in a number of waves, and recent archaeological discoveries and analysis of DNA of people's origins basically suggest now that people may have arrived in the Americas from East Asia up to 33,000 years ago.
So the numbers have changed considerably since I last looked. Now, it was always assumed, I think, that they crossed the Bering Strait and then they gradually worked their way down until they finally got to the end to Land's End, which of course was the south of what is now Chile and Argentina. There aren't some surprisingly old settlements found in the very far south.
Yes, going back at least 8,000, 10,000 years. Yes.
I see, but the first wave might be much, much earlier than that then. Yeah.
Yes, certainly the new evidence is coming out of Central America, Mexico and Guatemala, where often DNA is well preserved because of the climate.
The dry heat. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So rather, as in Egypt, all of these great antiquities and papyri and so on are preserved.
Yes, exactly. So, yes, it would appear that people did come from Asia to the Americas earlier than we had thought, and the evidence base is growing. Another interesting theory that we have some evidence for is a connection between people coming from Polynesia,
right,
and South America.
Right.
We have chicken bones that come from Polynesia, and possibly we have some human DNA evidence as well in parts of Chile and Peru.
I see, making it at one point all a great big cultural area with Australasia almost then and the entire Pacific.
Absolutely, and of course one very important human population is often associated with Taiwan and spread all throughout the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, all the way to Madagascar off the coast of Africa, all the way to Indonesia, and throughout the Pacific Islands. These people have a common ancestry with the Taiwanese Aboriginal people and also the Ainu of Japan, the Aboriginal people who still live in Hokkaido, have a connection with this original population that was isolated in Taiwan for a time.
Do we know anything about, do their languages survive? Because of course a way of tracing ancestries is through language. We have plenty of American languages, still alive. Do you know if they connect? Can they be connected?
There are only theories about some of the...
Because the separation would have been a very long time ago anyway.
Yes, that's a long, long time ago. We're talking about much greater than the spread of the languages from really the border between Europe and Asia into the Indo-European language family.
Yeah.
This is even before that.
Right. And languages can diverge pretty quickly.
Yes, pretty quickly in human groups communicating with their sounds. It is interesting, the Polynesians obviously were famous for their sailing, and it is very possible that they could come all the way from Easter Island, which was as far as we thought they had got, which actually belongs to Chile. Chile colonized Easter Island in 1888, I think.
Yes, so it was formerly independent.
Yes.
And
the British had some sort of presence there, but certainly the Chileans got hold of it. Imagine having a boat come from a European-style boat come. Oh, who could it be? Could it be the French? Culturally, it's a good time. They're not so good at organising roads and things.
That's right.
Could it be the English? All the trading. It's great. Maybe even the United States. No. It's Texas. No. The Chilean flag looks a bit like the Texas flag. No.
It does, with a Lone Star, yeah.
Chile. Wow. We've been colonized by Chile.
This is a first.
Yes.
That's right.
A wonderful experience. But of course, in 1947, the Norwegian modern explorer Thor Heyerdahl built an Inca-style raft. Well, that was one of his plans. He also built a Polynesian-style raft and sailed it in the opposite direction,
right?
From, I believe, Peru across the Pacific Ocean.
Right. Yes. So anything is actually possible.
It is possible. If you're brave enough or desperate enough, you can go.
And if enough time passes, and they had thousands of years in which to do this,
yes,
so it does seem perfectly possible.
Yeah.
So those are the origins, and so matters remained for a very long time, in which this essentially East Asian or possibly Polynesian population inhabited the Americas. Then, of course, Europeans arrived.
Yes.
And suddenly we have the Middle Ages. No, we had a few Vikings.
Yes.
That deals with the Middle Ages.
Yes.
And then we had the beginning of what the Europeans consider the modern era.
Yes, with Christopher Columbus most famously in 1492.
That's right.
And then pretty soon after that, there was a division of the newly discovered areas between the Portuguese crown and the Spanish crown.
That's right. Now, the Pope adjudicated, if I'm not mistaken,
Yes.
and gave everything west of a certain longitude, which escapes me for the moment.
Yes.
But you can see roughly on the map, to the Spanish, and everything east of that, in North and South America,
Yes.
to the Portuguese.
And Africa as well.
And Africa. So, in the eyes of God, or at least of the Catholic God,
Yes.
the English-speaking and indeed French-speaking presence in North America is simply a mistake.
Yes, they came a bit later.
That will one day be fixed.
Yes, and certainly that was the Treaty of Tordesillas of, I think it was 1498, but I might be wrong about that number. A very important division. And this created and strengthened the relationship between East Asia, particularly the Spanish colony in the Philippines,
Of course.
and the Spanish trade routes.
Right, the famous Manila Galleon.
The Manila galleons, and of course Manila itself was connected to China and East Asian culture in general.
That's right.
Bringing spices and things back and forth from the Americas. There was a huge exchange, particularly of plants,
Yep.
different kinds of fruits and vegetables between the Americas and Asia, and of course the Americas and Europe as well.
Of course. And so the Manila Galleon, well, in one direction it carried a lot of gold bullion,
Yes.
didn't it, from Peru,
Yes.
essentially. Why do they take it to the Philippines? Remind me.
Well, they were bringing other things. They were certainly trading with the East Asian area.
Yeah.
But most of the gold, of course, was taken from the Americas and deposited in Sevilla in Spain.
Yes, that's right.
And of course, the silver and other precious metals from the Americas, particularly in Upper Peru, there was a lot of silver, and that was largely brought.
So I suppose the Philippines, Manila was an entrepot. The gold was taken there because, of course, Peru was on the west coast.
Yes.
So it's more direct across the Pacific.
Well, yes, some of it went in that direction to buy things, particularly spices, obviously, which largely come from what's now Indonesia, and trade in all kinds of things, all manner of things, including people, of course. People were traded.
Right. Yes, I mean, after, of course, a long period of European immigration into the Americas, there was considerable movement of East Asians to the Americas, especially to Peru, wasn't there?
Yes.
As workers, as kind of indentured labourers. This was after the end of slavery, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, slavery ended at different times in the Americas. Of course, famously in the Civil War in the United States, which ended in 1865.
That's right.
In Chile, a bit earlier than that. It was organised in the 1820s.
That's right. I think in Brazil it ended embarrassingly late, didn't it, in the 1880s?
1888. And in fact, forms of slavery continued probably until the 1930s in isolated parts of Brazil. But one of the things that happened in Peru particularly and Brazil was that cheap labour was acquired from Asia, from the south of China particularly, but also from Japan.
That's right.
From Okinawa. Famously, whole villages of people were sold by the Japanese government.
Oh, really?
Yes, to producers of sugarcane and so forth in Brazil, and to some extent in Peru as well.
That's right, and that has an interesting post-history, doesn't it? Because the Japanese government in modern times, in an effort to increase its workforce because of the shrinking population, imported or invited a large number of Japanese Brazilians to settle back in Japan, and seems to have imagined that they would be culturally compatible because of their ancestry.
Yes.
And they in fact turned out to be completely Brazilian and quite unsuited to life in Japan.
Yes, a fairly diverse population as well, because some of them were descended from the indentured labourers and others were descended from entrepreneurial traders who were quite wealthy in Brazil.
I see.
And of course, Peru has a very famous political dynasty, the Fujimori dynasty.
Of course.
Alberto Fujimori, his parents arrived in Peru, I believe, in the 1920s or 30s.
That's right, and clearly prospered.
Yes. So there are these populations. They have a considerable cultural influence. Of course, the Japanese football team for a time had some great Japanese Brazilian players. I remember Alex was one of them back in about 1998, I believe.
I see. So they carried to Japan the absurd Brazilian custom of using only first names on their football shirts.
Yes, a lovely tradition.
I suppose so. I find it slightly irritating.
Yes.
Okay, but anyway, but in Peru it was predominantly Chinese rather than Japanese.
Yes, a huge
to work
proportion.
on the railways, in the mining industry.
And we'll go into that a bit later when we talk about food in the next episode, and Chile's role, which is something to look forward to. In the modern period, I guess when we say the modern period, we can talk about the period after the Second World War.
All right.
Which not many Latin American countries participated in very much. They sold things to both sides, mostly to the...
That's right. And I believe Chile declared war on Germany and Japan when it was clear that the war was only about a week away from ending.
It's very important to be on the side that's winning. That's
that's right.
That's diplomacy.
Latin America tends to specialise in civil war, doesn't it, more than in foreign ventures?
Yes.
There are remarkably few foreign wars fought between Latin American countries.
Yes.
But their civil wars are very almost constant.
But one global conflict that was very important was what followed the Second World War, the Cold War.
Of course.
So the rivalry between the Soviet Union and communism in general. Of course, the Soviet Union didn't often have very good relationship with China.
Of course.
But the Soviet Union had influence in different parts of the world, had influence in Cuba after the communist revolution there in the late 1950s.
Right.
And has had various influences in South America at different times.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things that happened in Chile was during the Cold War conflict in Korea in the early 1950s, when the US and its allies were fighting against China, basically backing up North Korea. Some North Korean Christians aligned to, I guess you would say, the United States, also in some way to Japan's former empire in Korea,
Of course.
were brought to Chile. So a small population of a few hundred North Koreans, Christians, were brought to Chile.
I see, and I think they must have multiplied because it is a reasonably visible population now, isn't it?
Yes, they certainly established a community that...
Yeah. And the whole community is from that base, or was there other immigration? No.
But they created contacts both with South Korea and also Japan to import different technologies, basically, more than anything. Technologies to make textiles, for example, sewing machines and so on. Agricultural technology from Japan and South Korea.
I see.
And that's a very interesting group, the North Koreans. In the 1970s, Chile had a military government.
You may have heard of a little military government. You may have heard of.
Yes,
that's right. The Pinochet, the notorious Pinochet regime,
which was very anti-communist, very strongly anti-communist, and very pro-United States, and also very pro-Japanese. And Japan began to invest in Chile in the late 1970s. The first Japanese restaurant in Chile arrived in 1980. It's called Hapon, which means simply Japan.
Of course.
But there were not very many Japanese restaurants for a time. We'll talk in the next episode about the explosion of sushi.
Yes, that's right.
But there was some connection with Japan, particularly during the 1980s. But in recent years, with the opening up of the Chinese economy, it's become very clear that the most important trading partner for many Latin American countries, and for Chile in particular, as a mineral producer and a producer of wood, its most important partner today
is China.
Is definitely China by a long way.
It's a completely symbiotic and non-competitive relationship, isn't it? Latin America has enormous amounts of natural resources.
Yes.
Not much manufacturing. There is some in Brazil and Argentina, and Mexico, of course, or towards the United States. But in Chile, there's very little manufacturing. I mean, they make cars in Bolivia, don't they? But Chile doesn't make cars.
No, it's not a natural strength.
And so, really, it's a perfectly non-confrontational relationship. Chile sells raw materials to China.
Yes.
In large quantities.
But I'll tell you something interesting. There's something very interesting about Latin American Spanish.
Yeah.
And that is that the same word that is used for China and Chinese, which is China, Chino, also refers to things being dirty or cheap.
Right.
And it's a very interesting story. For example, the rough area, like the red light district, I know there's one in many Japanese cities. I know in Okayama there's a place you can go and get a massage.
Right.
It's got a red light district. Soapland, I think it's called in Japanese tradition. In the red light district of many South American cities, one of the terms that will be used for that area is the barrio chino.
Right.
The Chinese neighborhood. And this is not the same as a Chinatown. There's Chinatowns all over the world.
Right.
Usually in ports.
That's right.
Chinese
just concentrations of Chinese people, Chinese restaurants, businesses.
Yes, but a traditional barrio chino in Latin America did not have Chinese people in it. It was simply a red light district. And the word chino is very interesting because it has a number of different meanings in Native American languages. In Mexico, a word which is something like chino means something cheap and messy.
I see.
In Peru, in Quechua, which is one of the most important languages, both for the number of speakers it has. It has several million speakers who speak it on a daily basis, but also because of its influence on the Spanish language, Quechua. China refers to a woman of indigenous heritage.
That's right, and it's used in that way here in Chile as well.
It's used in that way here in Chile. Also, one of the words for a pig coming from Spain is cochino.
Of course, cochino is actually a swine. Yes.
It's a pig, yes. Buta in Japanese. And the interesting thing about the word China in Spanish, China, is people are often confused about whether it means cheap, like in Nahuatl in Mexico, whether it means like an indigenous thing, like in Quechua, whether it means pig, shortening for pig, or whether it means from China.
This is all very confusing.
Yes. So many people in Latin America have strange beliefs about China. They think that China is dirty or cheap. And they've confused all of these ideas in their understanding. Now in Buenos Aires, there's a barrio chino that is actually a Chinatown.
How even confusion added upon confusion.
Yes. This is fairly typical of the globalization. People get confused about things and they fuse things together in interesting ways.
That's right, and different categories and different worldviews are suddenly forced together and cause everybody to scratch their heads.
Yes. But one thing's for sure, Latin American countries are learning fast about China, connections with China. Many Chinese people moved to Venezuela during its petrol boom and have been leaving Venezuela and establishing themselves in other countries, including Argentina and Chile. And they're usually very good traders. Now there's a lot of very good traders from China.
Right.
Yes.
And anyway, this adjustment in the view of China is taking place everywhere because, like Japan before it, I mean, I'm old enough to remember when Japan was associated with cheap imitations of Western goods.
That was never the case for me. So you're a little bit older than me. Yes.
Right. That marks a generation gap.
Yes.
And of course, that was left behind as Japanese economy became much more sophisticated. And now the same's happened to China. It still has that association with cheap goods, but it's rapidly changing as well.
Yes, that's changing, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, well, there's a little short potted introduction to the relationship between Latin America and East Asia. And in our next episode, probably once again, Pete will be doing most of the talking and I will be doing the interviewing. And we will be talking about the culinary relationship.
Yes.
Of East Asian food.
Yes.
In Latin America. So hope to see you then.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.